Hello everyone, tonight we're going to sink into something a little heavier than usual. Imagine a place so ordinary, so routine, that it fades into the background of daily life, a factory. Its chimneys coughing pale smoke against the night sky, its gates yawning wide to swallow tired men and women for another shift. Now picture this, the same factory at dawn, silent, its machines at rest, and not a single worker stepping back out. Hundreds of people gone, as if the earth simply swallowed them whole. That's the story we're following tonight, the vanishing of the Zone 6 factory workers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're here, tell us where you're watching from and what you do. Maybe someone nearby is listening to the same whispers tonight. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The Zone 6 factory wasn't famous. Built in the late 1970s on the edge of an industrial belt, it specialized in chemical coatings for textiles. Most of the workers were drawn from nearby housing blocks, fathers, mothers, young adults straight out of trade school. The place smelled of solvents and grease, its windows always fogged with condensation. By the mid-2000s, Zone 6 had become the largest employer in the district. Its night shift alone could number more than 200 people. But on the morning of March 14, 2012, the gates of the factory swung open on a scene that still unnerves investigators today. The day shift employees arrived to relieve their colleagues, but there was no one waiting. The guard booth was empty. Inside the complex, the conveyor belt stood idle, machines powered down in mid-process. Even stranger lunches sat half-eaten in the cafeteria. Coffee mugs steamed faintly as if abandoned seconds before. In the locker rooms, shoes, watches, and ID cards remained lined up waiting for owners who never returned. It was as if the night shift had evaporated in unison. At first, supervisors assumed some kind of coordinated strike or walkout, but the silence was too absolute. Phone calls to employees' homes went unanswered. Vehicles still sat in the parking lot, keys in ignitions. By mid-morning, family members had gathered outside the gates, pressing against the fences, demanding to know where their sons and daughters were. The local police were summoned. When they entered, their radios hissed with static. Reports from that morning described the officers walking through the plant floor with hands on their weapons, calling out names into the dim echo of machinery. No one answered. One officer later wrote, "The entire factory was like a snapshot frozen at 1 minute to midnight. There are certain eerie details you don't forget. A wall calendar marked with shift rotations. A chessboard in the break room with pieces mid-game. A vending machine jammed with coins that someone had never retrieved. Little fragments of a life cut short, reminding investigators that this wasn't abandonment, this was interruption. And here's a historical fact to ground us in 1900. The small Scottish island of Eilean Moor saw its 3 lighthouse keepers vanish, leaving behind a logbook that ended mid-sentence. Theories ranged from freak waves to madness, but no consensus was ever reached. The Zone 6 incident would echo that mystery a century later, only this time on an industrial scale. Stranger still, no alarms had been tripped. Surveillance cameras installed after a series of thefts were found powered down. Their feeds ended abruptly at 2:13 a.m. That timestamp would become infamous, the last official record of the workers' presence. By sunset that day, panic had spread. Some whispered of mass kidnappings. Others spoke of underground tunnels leading to human trafficking rings. The most unnerving rumor came from a retired engineer who claimed Zone 6 had always been more than a textile plant. He told anyone who would listen that the factory had been used during the Cold War to store experimental chemicals. His exact words were, "That place was built with more doors than it should have." Investigators and detectives are still debating whether that rumor was a convenient smokescreen or whether it hid something far darker. The gates of Zone 6 became more than just a factory entrance in the days following the disappearance. They became a shrine, a protest site, and a crime scene all at once. Families camped out on the sidewalks, clutching photographs of loved ones. Mothers taped posters to the rusted perimeter fences, each with pleading words. "Have you seen my son? Bring Anna home." The smell of candle wax and incense mingled with the sour tang of chemical runoff from the plant. Authorities were quick to cordon off the facility, stringing yellow tape across entrances and posting patrols. But as days turned into weeks with no answers, suspicions deepened. Local news crews filmed everything, crying children, factory corridors lit only by flickering fluorescent bulbs, the echo of investigators' boots as they walked through spaces that had once pulsed with human voices. The cafeteria remained one of the most disturbing sights. Meals had congealed into grotesque displays, soups with a film of grease, sandwiches, half-eaten utensils resting in trays. A clock on the wall had stopped at 2:14 a.m., its hands motionless though the batteries inside were brand new. And in the guard station logs showed check-ins for every worker that night, each one recorded and initialed. But the final entry, scribbled in a hurried hand, was almost illegible. Some thought it said transfer, others thought trapped. The handwriting analysis brought no consensus. There was, however, one undeniable fact: there were no footprints leading out. Teams brought in cadaver dogs. They combed through locker rooms, offices, even the surrounding marshland. The dogs would whine near the factory's southern wall, but then circle aimlessly, unable to lock on to a scent trail. It was as if 200 people had simply walked into the concrete and disappeared. Meanwhile, officials held press conferences repeating the same bland reassurances. We are investigating all leads. There's no danger to the public. But their eyes told a different story, nervous, evasive, as though they were speaking against their own knowledge. Here's where things start to get uncanny. A group of electricians contracted by the city were ordered to inspect the factory's wiring to see if maybe faulty power had led to the blackout in the surveillance cameras. One of them, a man named Rafael Cortez, later claimed that he found schematics in the substation that didn't match the blueprints on file. There was a whole level under the main floor that wasn't supposed to exist. He told a local paper before the story was abruptly pulled offline. That phrase, a whole level under the main floor, set off a storm. Were there tunnels, hidden rooms? When questioned, factory management flatly denied it. The building is exactly as inspected, the director insisted, his voice trembling on camera. Yet when journalists requested access to structural blueprints, they were told the documents had been lost in a fire. Historical precedent doesn't ease the chill here. In 1942, during the height of World War II, rumors spread of a Ukrainian factory where entire shifts of workers had disappeared after being forced underground to construct hidden bunkers. Soviet records later hinted at mass deaths covered up as industrial accidents. Officially, those records remain sealed, but the parallel is hard to ignore. Zone 6 began to feel less like a workplace and more like a mausoleum. People reported hearing noises inside at night, dull bangs, the scrape of metal, even faint cries that stopped as soon as guards approached. Police dismissed these as tricks of echo and imagination. Still, locals gathered outside the gates after sunset, straining to listen. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those sounds were staged to keep curiosity at bay, or if they were the last desperate attempts of workers trapped somewhere beneath the surface. The truth at this stage was only beginning to scratch the paint. By the third week, the Zone 6 investigation had shifted from confusion to dread. The absence of evidence was evidence in itself. Hundreds of people could not vanish without leaving a single coherent trace. Yet every hallway, every production line, every office yielded nothing but silence. Desperate for answers, detectives turned to the personal belongings left behind. Workers' lockers were pried open. Inside, family photos, prayer cards, spare uniforms, even unopened letters. In one locker, investigators discovered a notebook belonging to a young man named Ernesto. His final entry read, "Night shift, strange tonight. Supervisor told us not to ask about the noises. Feels like the walls are moving." The line ended abruptly, pen dragging off the page. Another haunting detail: time cards. The punch clock showed every worker clocked in at 10 p.m. as expected, but the machine spat out no records after 2:13 a.m., the exact moment surveillance cameras froze. Like the machinery itself had agreed on a conspiracy. Forensics experts scoured the plant floor for fingerprints or DNA out of place. They found a scattering of smudged handprints on the southern wall, too high for ordinary reach and streaked as if someone had been pulled upward. The plaster bore faint cracks shaped almost like the outline of a hidden doorway. When police tested the surface with ground-penetrating radar, results showed inconsistencies, hollow spaces beyond the wall. And then came the accident. A construction worker hired to reinforce the perimeter fell through a soft patch of flooring near the paint-mixing vats. Beneath the cracked cement was a cavity narrow, suffocating, descending into darkness. When he was pulled out shaken and pale, he swore he'd heard voices below. Not echoes, but whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping in frantic tones. The discovery made headlines, forcing authorities to acknowledge the possibility of underground structures. Officials attempted to control the narrative, saying the cavity was an old drainage shaft no longer in use, but privately investigators were furious. Why hadn't this been disclosed earlier? The whispers of Zone 6 grew louder. Talk of human trafficking gave way to darker theories. Some said the workers had been forced into secret tunnels to participate in government experiments. Others whispered of cults that required mass offerings of contracts signed in shadows. Historically, whispers like these aren't without precedent. In the 1970s, the Brazilian city of Fortaleza saw rumors of entire favela populations being rounded up for medical testing, while never proven testimonies decades later pointed to mass disappearances swept under bureaucratic rugs. The similarity was enough to make researchers uneasy, but not everyone accepted the supernatural or conspiratorial. One criminologist suggested that Zone 6 might have been the site of a meticulously planned mass kidnapping. Coordinated abductions are rare but not impossible, he explained. If the security system was compromised and the workers funneled underground, their removal could be executed in under 30 minutes. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was an industrial accident covered up with panic or something infinitely more sinister, an operation so carefully concealed that only faint cracks in a factory wall betray its existence. For now, all that remained on the surface was silence, punctuated by the rustle of posters on the gates and the sobs of those waiting for answers. When the hollow spaces behind the southern wall were finally confirmed, the case shifted from eerie to chilling. A team of engineers and forensic experts arrived with drill scanners and enough floodlights to illuminate a football field. The families of the missing pressed close to the gates, desperate to witness anything that might bring closure. The drilling began just after dawn. As chunks of plaster and rebar gave way, an unmistakable draft of cold air seeped out, carrying with it the metallic tang of rust, or perhaps something darker. Reporters jostled for position cameras, zooming in on the expanding hole. When the last slab crumbled, the beam of a flashlight cut into the opening and revealed a staircase spiraling down into blackness. The workers had been right. Zone 6 was hiding another level. Authorities were reluctant to let journalists follow the initial descent, but word leaked from one of the firemen who entered first. It was like stepping into another world. The walls weren't concrete. They were steel-polished, as if built for something secret, not industrial. The staircase ended in a corridor with numbered doors, each locked tight. Above one, a peeling placard read only S12. Inside, after breaking the lock, investigators found rows of narrow bunk beds, mattresses still indented, as if someone had lain there recently. A child's drawing of a house was pinned to the wall, but no people. Another room contained medical equipment, IV stands, glass vials, and a metal chair with restraints bolted to the floor. The smell of antiseptic lingered even after years of disuse. Someone whispered, "This isn't a factory, this is a lab." That night, the newspapers carried the headline, "Secret Basement Found in Zone 6. Panic surged. Families demanded immediate answers. Protesters clashed with police at the gates, chanting, "Where are our workers?" Here's a legitimate historical fact. During the 1950s, Operation Sea Spray in San Francisco secretly sprayed bacteria over the city to test biological warfare dispersion without citizens' knowledge. Several people fell ill, one fatally. When this surfaced decades later, the betrayal was undeniable. For residents watching Zone 6 unfold, the parallels were terrifying. Theories multiplied. Some said the workers had been forced into experiments and later disposed of. Others insisted they were alive, hidden deeper underground. The loudest theory claimed Zone 6 had been a front all along, a government-run site testing chemicals on unwitting laborers. One detail fueled the frenzy. Technicians recovered an old security tape overlooked in the initial sweep. The footage showed workers lining up at the southern wall around 2:12 a.m. A figure in a white lab coat gestured, and the wall seemed to slide open, revealing the staircase. The workers filed inside without resistance, as if obeying instructions they couldn't refuse. Then the tape cut to static. Families who saw the recording screamed in anguish. Why didn't they stop? One mother cried. But that was the strangest part, no signs of struggle, no panic. The march into the darkness looked almost voluntary. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the workers were coerced through chemical manipulation hypnosis or something else entirely. The truth remained locked in the corridors below, waiting to be dragged into the light. And the further investigators went, the darker the story grew. The discovery of the staircase had already shattered illusions about Zone 6 being just another textile plant. But what investigators uncovered in the deeper levels made the first rooms look almost mundane by comparison. The second descent went 3 stories below ground, each level colder and more suffocating than the last. Air meters crackled warnings. Oxygen was thin, carbon monoxide oddly elevated. Some officers wore masks, others braved the stench with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The corridor stretched longer than expected, ending in a massive chamber lined with observation windows. Behind each pane of glass lay smaller rooms, cells really outfitted with steel beds, drains in the floor, and overhead fixtures that weren't for lighting. They looked more like nozzles. In one chamber, the team found scattered papers. Much of the text was illegible, eaten by mildew, but a few phrases could be read: trial batch, exposure duration, not to exceed 120 minutes. The word batch appeared over and over, as if the workers were being processed, not employed. The most unnerving detail came from another cell. Scratched into the steel wall with some crude instrument were words in shaky Spanish. We were told this was for safety drills. The lines beneath it grew chaotic, ending in long gouges that trailed downward. News of these findings leaked despite efforts to contain them. By then, whispers in the crowd outside the gates had escalated into roars. They used them like lab rats, shouted one protester, holding up a handmade placard with a photo of his missing brother. Authorities attempted damage control, framing the basement as storage facilities abandoned decades earlier. But then a box of cassette tapes was uncovered, each labeled with dates and times matching factory shifts. When technicians managed to play one, the recording began with a calm male voice. Subject group Delta Exposure Cycle 1. Begin observation. The sound of coughing and frantic voices followed, cut short after exactly 2 minutes. Historical parallels are chilling here. In 1947, the U.S. Army's Edgewood Arsenal conducted chemical warfare experiments on thousands of servicemen, testing nerve agents and psychoactive drugs. For years, the victims were silenced, their stories buried under classified stamps. Zone 6 seemed to fit into that same lineage, secret science carved into human bodies. Still, skeptics questioned if experiments were ongoing. Where were the bodies? No corpses had been recovered. Some suggested the workers were still alive, hidden deeper within the labyrinth. Others feared the worst, that chemical disposal methods had erased all traces. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Zone 6 basement was a relic of Cold War paranoia or an active black site experiment in the 21st century. But one fact was undeniable: hundreds of factory workers had walked into those corridors on March 14th, and not one had walked back out. The corridors beneath Zone 6 had become a tomb with no graves, a silence with no answers. Yet deeper exploration was still to come, and with it the kind of revelations that make even seasoned investigators lose sleep. The 6th day of excavation into Zone 6's underbelly marked a breaking point for everyone involved. The team had already descended into 2 levels of hidden infrastructure, but when they forced open a rusted door at the end of the observation corridor, they discovered an industrial elevator shaft. Its cables were frayed, its cage dangling uselessly far below. Someone or something had used it heavily long after the factory was supposedly converted to a civilian textile site. Unable to operate the elevator safely, engineers rigged climbing equipment to descend. What awaited them was worse than anyone expected. The shaft opened onto a cavernous chamber filled with vats the size of swimming pools, each connected by pipes that snaked along the ceiling. Many vats still contained residue, thick tar-like sludge emitting a sharp chemical sting. Floating in one under the flashlight's beam was a single rubber glove, fingers bloated and curled. But it wasn't the vats that stopped the investigators cold. It was the mural painted on the far wall. Dozens of crude stick-figure workers drawn in smeared red pigment marched in a line toward an open door. At the bottom, scrawled words in Spanish read, "No return." Nearby, they found another room with stacked crates marked only by codes Z6E1, Z6E2. Opening one revealed glass canisters filled with murky liquid and organic fragments that looked disturbingly like tissue samples. Some of the jars had labels respiratory failure, neurological collapse. The revelation made its way to the outside world in whispers first. A local radio host reported live that Zone 6 is hiding a morgue. Crowds swelled overnight, pressing against the fences, chanting through megaphones, their voices carried into the bowels of the factory where investigators still worked. Here's a chilling historical fact. In 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment began in the United States, in which hundreds of black men were denied treatment so researchers could observe disease progression. The study ran for 40 years before exposure. That legacy of betrayal hangs like a ghost over every revelation in Zone 6. Skeptics tried to counter. These could be old storage tanks for chemicals, not evidence of human experiments. But then came the cassette labeled Night Shift Trial 14. Played on a rescued tape deck, it captured terrified shouts echoing in a metallic chamber. A woman's voice screamed, "Saquenos de aquí," get us out of here, before the recording cut abruptly. The effect was immediate. Families surged at the gates, some throwing rocks at security forces, others climbing fences in desperation. Police struggled to hold the line. One protester was quoted shouting, "They lied to us for decades. This isn't work. This is slaughter." Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the workers of March 14th were the final batch in a decades-long experiment, or whether Zone 6 was reactivated secretly in modern times. Either way, the silence of the subterranean chambers weighed heavier with every descent. The truth felt closer than ever, yet far darker than anyone had dared imagine. When the next descent into Zone 6 was made, the investigators were accompanied by forensic anthropologists. They'd been called after faint traces, shards of bone in the sludge teeth and drainage grates, suggested the missing workers hadn't simply vanished, but had been processed. On the third sublevel, behind a sealed steel hatch, they found the most horrifying evidence yet: a series of incineration furnaces. Each was equipped with conveyor belts and fitted with exhaust vents that led into the factory's towering smokestacks above ground. Suddenly, old testimonies from nearby villagers clicked into place, accounts of thick, sour smoke on nights when the factory was supposed to be closed. The furnaces weren't empty. Inside, one investigator found a pile of calcined remains so brittle they crumbled to dust upon touch. Forensic analysis confirmed fragments from at least 47 different individuals in that single furnace. And then there was the logbook. Found in a locked drawer near the furnaces, it was water-damaged but legible in parts. Each page listed dates, batch numbers, and chillingly sterile phrases like batch D14 terminated processed. The last entry was dated March 14th, the very day the workers vanished. The discovery leaked almost instantly. A photo of the logbook, smuggled out by an anonymous source, hit social media within hours. Headlines screamed across the world, "Zone 6 is a death factory." Families of the missing collapsed in grief outside the gates. The government tried to seal the story under the banner of ongoing investigation, but the narrative had escaped containment. To understand the scale, we must remember historical precedents. In World War II, the Nazis disguised mass killings as work camps, complete with falsified records and coded language processed, terminated that stripped humanity from the victims. The vocabulary of Zone 6 echoed that nightmare too closely to ignore. But skeptics clung to questions. If hundreds had been incinerated, why weren't there more ashes, more remains? Why did so many tapes refer to exposure cycles instead of disposals? That answer arrived when the team breached a side corridor near the furnaces. It led to an underground rail track, a narrow-gauge train system. Abandoned carts sat rusting, some still carrying crates stenciled with symbols that matched the jars of biological samples found earlier. Zone 6 wasn't just disposing of workers. It was exporting something. The implications widened into something international, something systemic. If the batches weren't simply killed but also harvested for experimental results, then Zone 6 might not have acted alone. The horror was no longer contained within one factory. It stretched outward like a web waiting to be fully traced. The revelation of the underground rail tracks turned everything upside down. It meant the furnaces weren't the final step, they were a smokescreen. Literally. The furnaces consumed some victims enough to terrify and confuse investigators, but the majority of processed batches were taken elsewhere. The investigators followed the rusted tracks deeper, guided by the bitter metallic smell lingering in the air. After a kilometer, they reached a chamber where the rail system split into 3 tunnels, each reinforced with heavy doors. 2 were collapsed from decades of disuse, but the third door still hummed faintly. When touched, there was power running behind it. When they pried it open, what lay beyond was no longer a factory but a laboratory. Banks of broken computers lined the walls, tangled in a nest of wires. Dozens of cracked glass pods filled the room, some still streaked with dried residue that bore DNA traces. Inside one pod, a half-preserved torso floated in thick, syrupy liquid muscle tissue fused with metal fragments, the skin marked with surgical notations. Whatever Zone 6 had been, it wasn't just an industrial plant. It was a test site. A senior investigator described the atmosphere best: it was as if someone had tried to re-engineer human beings into something else, and then burned the evidence when it got too close to exposure. Academic circles erupted. Historians drew parallels to Unit 731, the infamous Japanese biological warfare unit during World War II, where human beings were exposed to disease, frostbite, and mutilation in the name of experimentation. Others pointed to Cold War black sites where intelligence agencies had allegedly conducted illegal medical testing under the cover of secrecy. But the most disturbing evidence wasn't biological, it was logistical. Stacks of manifests were found in a metal locker, each stamped with the insignia of an international shipping company. They documented shipments of organic compounds and biological composites leaving Zone 6 and moving across borders. Some shipments were traced to private laboratories in Switzerland, others to pharmaceutical hubs in East Asia. Suddenly, the mass disappearance of workers didn't look like an isolated atrocity. It looked like supply. And just when the investigators thought the web couldn't stretch any further, they uncovered something worse: surveillance footage, decades old, preserved on reels of magnetic tape. Grainy black and white images flickered across the projector. The footage showed groups of workers being marched into pods, sealed in, and subjected to controlled bursts of gas or radiation. Their screams, though silent on film, were visible in every frame. One clip ended with a chilling detail: a scientist unmasked, standing proudly before the camera. He wore no insignia, no name tag, but on the wall behind him hung a banner with 3 bold letters, Z6. The unanswered question now loomed larger than ever. Zone 6 wasn't just killing, it was collecting. By now, Zone 6 was no longer just a local scandal, it was a geopolitical powder keg. The existence of manifests linking the factory to international laboratories meant there were beneficiaries far beyond the rusted walls of that industrial grave. Investigators returned to the underground laboratory for a second sweep. This time, they dug deeper into the manifests, cross-referencing shipping codes with customs records. One pattern emerged with chilling clarity: the organic compounds were shipped in regular cycles, coinciding almost perfectly with the dates listed in the furnace logbook. The batches weren't merely experiments, they were exports of human remains reconfigured for someone else's use. The team found another section of the sublevel sealed with lead panels. When they broke through, the air was toxic, laced with formaldehyde and something sourer. The chamber beyond resembled a morgue, but each slab was fitted not with bodies but with storage canisters numbered and color-coded. Many were empty, their seals broken decades ago. A few, however, still contained tissue samples suspended in amber liquid meticulously labeled by gender, age, and health condition. One container held the preserved brain of a young woman. Notes scrawled nearby suggested neural testing attempts to stimulate or alter cognition through chemical saturation. Another, labeled Batch R, contained what appeared to be fused skeletal remains, as though bones had been artificially welded into a lattice. Theories swarmed. Was Zone 6 building a black market organ trade, or were they supplying clandestine military programs attempting to design biologically enhanced soldiers? Historians pointed out that both theories had precedent. The Nazi regime had performed grotesque surgeries for military research, while in the 1960s, the CIA's MKUltra sought to weaponize the human mind. But what chilled everyone most was the calendar. Pinned on the wall behind a rusted file cabinet was a factory schedule that didn't end with the last recorded disappearance. The dates extended into the present year, meaning someone had been maintaining the site long after the workers' vanishing. That suspicion grew when security cameras captured faint light deep in the tunnels hours after investigators had sealed the area. When a team rushed back in, they found evidence of fresh footprints in the dust. Whoever had been operating Zone 6 hadn't abandoned it, they were still checking on it. Panic spread among the investigators. If Zone 6 was still active, it meant the factory workers of the infamous disappearance weren't the last victims, they were just part of a chain that might still be unbroken. The revelation that Zone 6 was still being monitored jolted the investigation into high alert. Security was doubled and access to the tunnels was restricted, but the sense of being watched never left. Investigators reported hearing distant metallic clanks echoing through sealed corridors, the faint hum of generators restarting somewhere below. One night, a patrol team stationed near the rail tracks picked up a signal on their handheld radios, a burst of static followed by a faint voice repeating the same word, batch. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only silence. Analysts later confirmed the frequency didn't match any official broadcast. Someone underground had tapped the channel deliberately. Digging deeper into the manifests, a pattern revealed itself that was even more sinister. The exports were timed around labor strikes or sudden accidents in other industrial sectors. Every time a group of workers disappeared in one country, there was a corresponding spike in shipments from Zone 6's network. It painted a horrifying picture, not just one disappearance, but a chain of vanishings connected across borders. To test this theory, investigators cross-referenced missing persons archives from the late 20th century. A chilling trend appeared: multiple incidents of entire work crews vanishing from remote construction sites in Eastern Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia. None had ever been solved. Now Zone 6 looked like the missing piece tying them all together. But the smoking gun came from a single crate found sealed in the tunnels, marked with an outbound shipping label that had never been processed. Inside was a collection of personal effects, boots, lunch pails, and ID cards, all belonging to the missing workers from the Zone 6 disappearance. Atop the pile was something worse, a ledger. Unlike the previous log books that masked atrocities in coded language, this one was blunt. It listed names, ages, and disposition. Most entries ended with shipped. The names matched the missing workers exactly. The global implications ignited academic and political debates. Was this evidence of a multinational conspiracy to harvest human labor and bodies for profit? Some scholars argued it echoed patterns of forced labor camps throughout history, where human beings were simultaneously exploited and erased. Others proposed a darker possibility, a clandestine alliance between governments and corporations to fuel experiments in secret. And still, the lingering footprints and faint electrical hum below the factory whispered that the network was not just historical, it was alive, its operators moving carefully in the shadows. The investigators faced a dilemma: shut down the site and risk losing their unseen adversaries forever, or keep it open and hope to catch whoever was still working the machinery of death. The decision was made to keep Zone 6 under covert surveillance. Cameras and motion detectors were installed in the tunnels, designed to be as discreet as possible. For weeks there was silence, no intruders, no strange noises. Then, just as investigators began to doubt their instincts, something happened. At 2:17 a.m. on a rain-soaked night, one of the motion sensors tripped. The feed flickered grainy and distorted, but it captured a figure moving through the underground rail corridor. The person was dressed in a protective suit, the kind used in hazardous chemical labs, with a full-face respirator. They moved with practiced confidence, pausing only to examine sealed crates before disappearing deeper into the tunnels. A rapid response unit followed, but by the time they reached the chamber, the figure was gone. The crates had been tampered with. One previously sealed now stood open and empty. Whatever had been inside, whether document samples or evidence, was taken. The break-in confirmed suspicions. Zone 6 was not abandoned. It was still in use, maintained by an unknown group with resources and knowledge far beyond a lone survivor. In the days that followed, more disturbing discoveries surfaced. Hidden cameras recorded faint glows emanating from the laboratory pods, as though someone had reconnected power lines investigators had cut. Then came the most horrifying find: fresh biological residue inside one of the pods, too recent to belong to the decades-old experiments. DNA analysis revealed it didn't match any of the long-missing workers. Instead, it belonged to someone who had vanished just 3 months prior, a young man reported missing from a construction site hundreds of miles away. The case had mutated from a historical atrocity into an active horror. Zone 6 wasn't just a relic, it was a functioning node in a network of abductions and experiments. Public pressure mounted after these leaks reached the media. Families of other vanished workers across the globe began petitioning governments demanding answers. Demonstrations broke out, some holding signs that read, "We are all Zone 6," and yet officials wavered, unwilling to expose how deep the ties might run. Were private corporations involved, intelligence agencies, or both among investigators? One theory gained traction: Zone 6 was part of a rotating system. Each time public scrutiny grew too sharp, the operators shifted to another location, leaving ruins behind. This factory then might just be one mask among many. The chilling question lingered: how many more factories were still active, hidden in plain sight, waiting for their next batch? The discovery that Zone 6 was still harvesting fresh victims shattered any illusion of historical closure. Suddenly, the case was no longer about justice for workers lost decades ago. It was about stopping an ongoing system of abductions and experimentation. To escalate the investigation, an international task force was convened. Representatives from multiple countries arrived at the site, their presence both a shield and a threat. Cameras rolled as politicians gave speeches outside the rusted gates, promising transparency and accountability. But inside the tunnels, the atmosphere was very different. Investigators whispered about sabotage, about data disappearing from evidence lockers overnight. Someone inside the task force was working against them. The decisive breakthrough came from a forensic cryptographer who cracked encrypted files found in one of the stolen hard drives recovered near the rail system. The files mapped out shipments not just from Zone 6, but from dozens of other facilities, each marked with a code name, a location, and a date. Some were already crossed out as if decommissioned. Others were still active. Among the active sites were places that had their own urban legends of mass disappearances: a South American mine where workers supposedly fled after a cave-in, a Russian research outpost abandoned without explanation, a Southeast Asian fishing fleet that never returned to port. Zone 6 was part of something sprawling, systematic, and horrifyingly efficient. But even this revelation wasn't the worst. Tucked among the files was a series of video recordings. They showed experiments in progress, not grainy old reels, but high-definition footage from within the last year. In one, a man in overalls screamed as his body convulsed inside a sealed pod, his veins blackening under injected fluids. In another, a young woman was subjected to hours of light and sound exposure until she collapsed unresponsive. Each video ended with the same phrase typed across the screen: batch complete. The recordings were traced back not to Zone 6, but to another site listed under the codename Haven 12. And this was where the investigators realized the cruelest truth. While they were crawling through the ashes of Zone 6, the operators had already shifted their focus elsewhere. Academics entered the debate with urgency. Some compared the findings to historical atrocities hidden under the guise of science: Tuskegee experiments, Unit 731, Cold War brainwashing trials. Others insisted the evidence pointed not just to governments, but to a corporate syndicate with enough money to buy silence across borders. And in the middle of this maelstrom, the families of the missing still waited, clutching photographs, begging for closure. But closure seemed farther away than ever. For Zone 6 was no longer the central mystery. It was only the doorway. With the discovery of Haven 12 and the possibility of dozens more active facilities, the Zone 6 investigation spun into chaos. The media dubbed it the Black Network, a term that stuck, though no one could quite agree whether it was a secret multinational project, a rogue syndicate, or a hidden alliance of governments. Inside the task force, trust eroded quickly. Evidence kept vanishing. One morning, a storage room where biological samples were kept was found ransacked, the vials shattered, the freezers unplugged. Security footage showed nothing, just static at the exact hours the breach had occurred. It was clear the people running Zone 6 were still watching, still reaching in. Determined to seize the narrative, the investigators released one of the recovered videos to the public, a blurred but undeniable clip of a man screaming inside a pod as machinery hissed around him. The footage sparked worldwide outrage. Protests erupted across cities, with demonstrators chanting "Shut them down" and waving banners of the missing workers' faces. Forensic teams then uncovered a fresh horror inside Zone 6 itself. In a chamber long thought collapsed, they discovered a hidden elevator shaft. It led to a chamber far deeper than any previously mapped. Here the walls were lined with rows of cryogenic units, some still glowing faintly with power. Several were empty lids thrown open, but others still contained bodies. Some of the frozen figures were easily identifiable as factory workers from the Zone 6 disappearance, but others were more recent faces that matched missing persons reports filed only months ago from faraway countries. It was undeniable Zone 6 was not a closed chapter. It was an active freezer, a storage site. The academic debate reached fever pitch. Some scholars argued that the network was harvesting humans as raw material for medical and military breakthroughs, a grotesque form of research supply. Others believed something even darker, that the workers weren't just victims, but prototypes in an attempt to engineer new forms of human endurance. And then came the final, most chilling clue. A digital map recovered from one of the cryogenic control panels displayed blinking red dots. Not just in the Zone 6 region, but across the world, dots scattered across continents like a constellation. Each dot marked another site. Each dot represented another disappearance waiting to happen. The question that haunted everyone now was not what Zone 6 had done. It was how many more zones were out there. The blinking constellation on the recovered digital map shattered any illusion that Zone 6 was a lone aberration. Overnight, the case expanded from a chilling local mystery into the suggestion of a worldwide network of factories, laboratories, and black sites. Investigators whispered among themselves, if Zone 6 was just one node, how many lives have already disappeared into the others? The International Task Force scrambled to verify the map. Within weeks, 3 of the red dots corresponded to known ghost sites: a Peruvian mine where dozens of workers had vanished in the 1990s, a Siberian research base abandoned under structural failure, and a shipping yard in Southeast Asia whose crew had disappeared en masse. Each location carried an official explanation, but now those stories unraveled like smoke. Meanwhile, Zone 6 itself seemed to resist closure. On a late-night sweep, technicians found a fresh crate left near the underground rail line. It wasn't on any inventory. Inside were sealed glass vials, each labeled with codes not previously seen: EVO 27, EVO 31. One vial contained a dark liquid that seemed to pulse when exposed to light. Another carried strands of hair that, under microscopic analysis, revealed unnatural mutations in their DNA. The implications were horrifying. Zone 6 wasn't just storing bodies, it was cultivating results. Debates raged in universities and parliaments, in hushed conversations at cafes. Was the purpose of this network to push human biology into new realms, to feed a black market biotech industry? Or was it part of something militaristic, an arms race fought not with missiles, but with human experiments? The task force attempted to shut down Zone 6, entirely flooding lower levels with concrete. But 3 nights later, motion detectors once again caught movement in the tunnels. The feed showed hazmat-suited figures inspecting the sealed areas with handheld scanners. Then one of them looked directly into the camera before the feed cut to black. It was as though the operators were reminding the investigators who was really in control. For families of the missing, the agony deepened. They had prayed for remains, for something to bury. Instead, they were faced with the horror that their loved ones had been packaged, shipped, or stored as if they were raw commodities. The cruelest twist came when a whistleblower stepped forward, a scientist claiming to have worked in one of the network's other sites. His message was brief, trembling, delivered through a voice-altering filter: Zone 6 is only a factory. The real project is global. You cannot shut it down. You can only expose it, and even that will not save you. The words sent a chill through the investigators. If true, then the vanishing workers of Zone 6 were just one chapter in a story that had no end. The whistleblower's warning echoed through the tunnels of Zone 6 like a prophecy. Investigators, journalists, and grieving families clung to the hope that exposing the truth might cripple the network. But the deeper they dug, the more monstrous the machinery appeared. The final breakthrough came from one of the stolen vials labeled EVO 31. A geneticist on the task force analyzed its contents and discovered a serum designed to alter cell regeneration. In controlled conditions, it accelerated tissue repair, but at the cost of horrific mutations. Photographs from other zones smuggled out by anonymous sources showed test subjects whose bodies had twisted under the serum's effects. Some were grotesquely enlarged, their bones stretching beyond normal limits. Others simply broke down their organs, liquefying under the strain, and the logs tied it all together. The missing workers of Zone 6 hadn't just been murdered, they had been used. Their bodies and suffering had been harvested, packaged, and shipped as data, as tissue, as product for a sprawling enterprise. In one chilling entry, a scientist had scrawled in the margins, "Batch Z6 was a success." Survivors retained cohesion for 27 hours before collapse. Recommend expansion of trials in Haven 12. The investigators realized then that the workers hadn't been intended to survive at all. They were raw material in a global experiment to re-engineer humanity. Governments publicly denied involvement, yet leaked memos suggested at least some nations knew of the network and tolerated it for the promise of breakthroughs in medicine, warfare, or control. Academic debates raged. Was this a continuation of historical atrocities like Unit 731 or Tuskegee disguised under modern science, or was it something even more insidious, a corporate empire feeding off expendable laborers? For the families, the truth was a blade with no handle. They finally knew why their loved ones had vanished, but closure was impossible. No graves to visit, no bodies to mourn, only the knowledge that their kin had been consumed by a machine too vast to topple. The final scene in Zone 6 came when the task force attempted one last sweep before shutting the factory down for good. As the team descended, the cameras captured a faint glow in the lowest chamber. Rows of cryogenic pods, once thought deactivated, were pulsing faintly, their lights flickering like heartbeat monitors. And in one of them, a face pressed against the glass, eyes open, watching. The pod's status read, "Batch pending." Investigators fled, sealing the chamber behind concrete and steel, but the haunting thought lingered: if just one pod was still active, how many more across the globe were humming quietly, waiting for the next batch to arrive? The story of the Zone 6 workers ended not with closure, but with a shiver. They had become the unwilling foundation of a project too large to fully comprehend, and their legacy was a map of red dots blinking like warning lights across the earth. And somewhere in an office far away, someone was surely looking at that same map, deciding where the next shipment would begin.